Hello, and welcome to another softly spoken video from me, the Welsh Lady. Now, I love books. I also love charity shops, and I love nostalgia. Well, these three worlds have collided for today's video. Recently, I went shopping for books in a charity shop, and I found a beauty full of nostalgia. Let me show you. This is called a Reader's Digest, Yesterday's Britain, and it's a sort of a scrapbook of history of Great Britain from 1900 until 1980. I have loved glancing through this book. Now, of course, I don't remember most of these decades, but my parents and grandparents talked about the war years and the years after. My grandmother on my mother's side was born in 1897. So she was a young girl, as well as all of her brothers and sisters in the 20s and 30s. I've inherited the family photo album, and it's full of photos of my grandmother and her sisters in the 1920s, 30s and beyond. So even though I didn't live through these years, I feel quite attached to them. You might feel the same. You might have lived through different decades or feel close to earlier years because of family stories. That's what I have loved about this book. The photographs in there could be from any of our family members. Now, I can't possibly hope to cover this book in enough detail on just one video. So I'm planning on doing a series, and I'm going to take one of the chapters in this book per video. I hope you enjoy the series, and do remember to subscribe so that you can keep up with all the decades that I will be talking about in this book. So for today's video, I am going to introduce the book, and we are going to look at the decades from 1900 to 1919. Here we have the Reader's Digest, Yesterday's Britain, the illustrated story of how we lived, worked and played. Let's have a little look inside. I grew up in a terraced house in a small village in the 70s, and I had neighbours, and they looked exactly like these ladies. And almost all day long they would be chatting over their shared garden wall just like this, wearing headscarves and little aprons, as people did even back in the 70s. Now, this book was published for the millennium. It was published in 1999, so it was a bit of a celebration of the first 100 years. And as I said, today we're going to look at the first decade that's celebrated in this book. Well, it's the first 20 years actually. But just as an introduction to this book, it calls itself a family scrapbook for the nation. And as I said earlier, I have inherited a really lovely photo album of my mother's aunts, uncles and mother when they were young in the 20s and 30s, and I love looking at that. And maybe you've got a similar family album. Well, this book says here it is an intimate family scrapbook of the nation. It is full of photographs and images, incidents and anecdotes which will strike a light in the memory of anyone who has spent their life in this country. It will evoke all kinds of half-forgotten experiences, from the itch of school trousers in September to the chore of cooking by candlelight in a power cut. Maybe some of you have got memories of earlier decades than I do. But look at these poor little school children. They look younger than 5. And they are with their, presumably, school nurse who is helping them try on their gas masks. So today we're going to look at this chapter, 1900 to 1919, and it's subtitled In the Good Old Days. And it says here, first few years of the 20th century were spent in the warm afterglow of the Victorian age. And this charming photograph of some young men having a little drink. These are university students enjoying a Whitsuntide drink at the turn of the century. And I'm presuming that these are better off people than the majority in the working class. And this chapter, or this little section here, is the clock strikes 12, and it's about the beginning of the 20th century. And here's a fact I didn't know. The 20th century began with an argument. Britain could not make up its mind where the boundary between the 2 centuries lay. The Zeroists were adamant that the new century started when 1899 gave way to 1900. But they were in the majority. Most people agreed that 1900 was the last year of the old century. And so their centennial celebrations began on the eve of 1901. And it says here they could not have known that their impatient descendants would take the opposite view, and that the passing of the second millennium would be marked an incomplete 99 years hence. Do you remember what you did on the eve of the millennium, 1999? I certainly remember, because my daughter was born just a week before. She was actually due on the eve of the millennium, but she was early. So it was a very quiet, sober night in for me and my daughter and my son. And I think we just watched the fireworks, nervously awaited to see if the millennium bug was going to cause chaos. Never even entered my head that maybe the century or the millennium should have begun at the end of 2000. But yeah, I hadn't realised that the 20th century began at the end of 1900. Anyway, here's a lovely photograph of the Queen Victoria. It's subtitled We Three Kings. So although we're with Queen Victoria here, she celebrated her Diamond Jubilee knowing that the succession was assured, and here she is with 3 future kings. We've got her son, the future Edward VII, her grandson, King George V, and who was born to be king, Edward VIII, of course. He never did, he abdicated, so it was his brother who became king. So my grandmother was born in the Victorian age. I really wish I'd asked my grandmother more questions about life in the early part of the century. I wish I'd asked. I was just young and I didn't really think about it, but of course there's no one living now in 2023 who has any memory of 1900, because that would make them 123. Now, my father was born in 1921. That is for a later video. This era would have been my grandmother's age. And I do have some photos in that album I was talking to you about of my grandmother and her siblings as young children in this sort of era. And I believe my grandmother did go into service, or maybe she didn't, but one of her or more of her sisters did, because being a domestic servant was the lot for many, many girls and of course boys, because the middle classes were looked after by an array of servants living below stairs, and that was life, and a hard life it was. I don't think maybe it says here the working day was an average grueling 17 hours. Certainly no 2 days off a week. And then, of course, the ladies were corseted up. I really love looking at these little adverts. A little advert here for a electric corset. The mind boggles. What did the electric corset do exactly? This beautiful lady in this photograph is the caption here: the Edwardian ideal of comeliness was epitomised by Gibson girl Camille Clifford. That must be her. Her form would have been impossible to achieve without the use of stays. Commercial experiments, such as the health-giving electric corset, aimed to counter the feeling that tight-laced underclothes caused harm to women. And this picture is of some children, and it says here, education for most children was basic. We used to learn on an abacus, remembers Ted Harrison, who grew up in North London, and writing began with tracing letters with a finger in silver sand. If you were in the upper class, a upper-class boys would be plucked from their homes and packed off to the peculiar English exile of public school. I'm sure this was harsh for many children, regardless of whether you were working class or upper class. And then some beautiful, I would love for a day to dress up like this. I love the hats with the veils. I love watching costume dramas on the TV and these absolutely stunning gowns. I'd love to wear one, but just for a day. Imagine how long it took, and of course all the servants needed to pull in the corsets. Yeah, hard work. But it says as the Edwardian era progressed, there were signs that the corset was loosening its grip, and rational clothing was gaining momentum among new women. And these ladies were looking to ride the bicycle, but they couldn't do it in clothes like this, of course. And at the same time, women were asserting their rights in a more vocal and forthright way. In 1903, Miss Emmeline Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union. The aim of this group was to win for women the right to vote in parliamentary elections. It's really hard to believe. It seems a long, long time ago, but really this is just recent history that women had to fight to get the vote. And we owe them a huge debt, these brave women. This page is looking at the pub, the British pub. And I do love when you go to city or smaller towns, but the big cities where you see pubs like this on the corner. I love going in an old-fashioned pub. Of course, there's lots in London with all the gorgeous Victorian tiles. And the caption here, pubs were cathedrals to beer, and most of the working population enjoyed a pint or two. During the Great War, they imposed closing hours to reduce the drinking time. So more on the women campaigning for rights to vote. And then, of course, we come to the Great War, the war to end all war. And of course we know that that wasn't the case. The Great War brought the summary idyll of the Edwardian age to a cataclysmic end. But in the early days, according to this book, people welcomed the news that we were going to war. The news of war was greeted with round after round of cheers by the crowds in Trafalgar Square. Many surged towards Buckingham Palace and were rewarded with the sight of the King and Queen on the balcony. And here we've got young boys eager to sign up. And of course at home, the women did men's jobs. This is a photograph of a father and his daughter helping him work at a signal box on the railways. Many industries were staffed by young women alongside men who were too old to serve. This little, I don't know where it would have come from, some kind of illustration, and the caption, a little girl sitting on her dad's lap. Daddy, what did you do? in the Great War. And I know my mother talked about her father who went to war in the First World War, and he did time in India. But my father, who was in the Second World War, they came back, and these men and women did not talk about the war. A few stories I remember my dad talking about. He tended to say the same stories, but you just can't imagine the horrors that they saw. Awful picture here of the devastation at the Somme. And the women, here they are, look, climbing ropes to get up on their stations in the cranes in the armaments factory. On a positive for these women, they were earning more than 4 times the wage of a parlour maid. So, and here, picture of a Zeppelin that came down, shot down over Essex. And here we've got a timeline from 1900 to 1919. So 1900, we've got American entrepreneur Charles Candler arrives in Britain with a jug of his new drink, Coca-Cola. 1901, Queen Victoria dies, and she was 81. 1902, what we got here? Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle and the Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling. And the Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potters, with the books out this year. 1903, what we got here? The government rejects the idea of imposing penalties for drink driving. 1904, books of stamps go on sale for 2 shillings for 24. 1905, Albert Einstein, a 26-year-old patent clerk, publishes a special theory of relativity which shows that measurements of time and space are variable. 1906, SOS becomes the International Distress Signal. 1907, Lord Baden-Powell initiates the Boy Scouts movement with a camping trip to Brownsea Island. 1908, London hosts the Olympic Games. 1909, British subjects over the age of 70 become entitled to a pension. That must have made an enormous difference for elderly people. 1910, Edward VII dies of bronchitis, so he had a very short reign, didn't he? 1911, the Shops Act makes all employees entitled to a half-day holiday once a week. Oh my goodness. 1912, of course, the year the unsinkable Titanic goes down on her maiden voyage after hitting an iceberg. 2013, Suffragette Emily Davison dies of injuries after being trampled by the King's horse. I've actually seen footage of that. Pretty awful to look at, actually. 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria is assassinated by Serbian nationalists in Sarajevo. And this was the year, of course, that Germany declares war on Russia and France. Britain declares war on Germany when it violates Belgian neutrality. 1915, photographs are fixed to British passports. 1916, conscription is introduced for single men. 1917, bread rationing begins, but women are permitted to drive taxis. 1918, women over 30 are granted the right to vote. Men can vote at 21. And the Royal Air Force is created when the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service merge. And 1919, Ernest Rutherford splits the atom, and the Treaty of Versailles settles the terms for peace and for reparations to be paid by Germany. Well, in the next video, we're going to be looking at 1920 to 1929, A Land Fit for Heroes. Now, that's coming next time. And there's a taster for things to come. Here are some of the other pages that we will enjoy in this book. So don't forget to subscribe so that you can be updated when I load a new video. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you on the next one.